This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is popular science writer Jared Diamond. I have Jason Antrosio, a cultural anthropologist, who will talk about the pros and cons of the man and his ideas, and the conversation will begin in a moment. Cultural anthropologist Jason Antrosio is my guest. We will be talking about Jared Diamond and his series of books about humanity and what it is. Jason has been a vocal critic of Jared Diamond's, but before we get into who Jared Diamond is, let me ask who Jason Antrosio is. So Jason, if you could take a couple of minutes and give a little background about yourself.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I teach at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York. I've been teaching cultural anthropology since 2001. That's when I got my PhD from Johns Hopkins University. I did my field work in Colombia and in Ecuador on peasants and globalization. So I kind of wandered into Jared Diamond from teaching more than I did from research. I assigned his Guns, Germs, and Steel to one of my classes. It got me thinking about work and its impact on students over the years.
Well, I will be linking to your Hartwick page as well as your Living Anthropologically website as well, so people after watching this could find out more about you. But let's talk about who Jared Diamond is, and I'm sure someone in your field knows who he is. When I told my wife what the subject was, she said, "You're doing a show about that kid Screech from the 1980s sitcom Saved by the Bell?" I said, "No, that's, I think, Jared Diamond. This is, I don't do shows about wayward child stars turned felons. This is about a guy who's a scientist." So if you could give a little bit of a background about Jared Diamond and his sort of place right now in pop culture and science.
Right, so I mean, it's interesting because Jared Diamond, I think of him as an extremely well-known figure, right? And but if you type it in, you get Jared Diamond Jewelers,
Yeah.
or I actually often ask my anthropology class, heard of Jared Diamond? It's still pretty minimal, at least among the students. So
Wow.
I mean, he's extremely well known as a popularizing science.
Again, let's talk about Diamond. He has a handful of books that have been quite popular and quite the bestsellers. He's sort of, in some ways, anthropology's answer to what Carl Sagan was back in his heyday in terms of people reading the books. Let's just talk a little bit about, just give a small précis of some of the books. The first book I think that he wrote in the popular science vein was Third Chimpanzee. I think he wrote a few technical books back in the 80s. I think he was into botany and that kind of thing. But the first book that really made his name was The Third Chimpanzee. Can you give me just a précis of what that was about?
Right. Well, actually, I'd like to go back a little bit.
Okay, go ahead.
He started out his scientific life, I believe, as an ornithologist.
Okay, ornithologist.
Studying gallbladders of birds in Papua New Guinea. And his first article that kind of broke onto the scene as sort of Jared Diamond, that was much more popular than his scientific work, was an article called "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race." And that was published in 1987. And it drew on the work of anthropologists, especially an anthropologist named Richard Lee, who did his work among the Kalahari Bushmen at the time they were called, and basically it was basically claiming that agriculture was the worst mistake that it had led to all the evils that we have today. That was really kind of a critical entry piece. It was published on Discover magazine. He never really credited Richard Lee or the anthropological work that was being done, and it came out in a volume called So it's interesting that that kind of, I think he sort of realized that he could get a lot more mileage if he went into that kind of popular writing. Now that article got repurposed in the book you're talking about, The Third Chimpanzee, which was in some ways a more biological anthropology type book about the human animal, and obviously we are a kind of version of the chimpanzee. So, I mean, he used, in some of the article, The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race, shows up in the third chimpanzee, but you're correct, that's the first time he kind of bursts onto the scene as someone commenting about human evolution and about basically what you might consider biological anthropology.
And the next book, some years later, was called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and I believe that won a Pulitzer Prize, and that's probably his most well-known work to date. And his basic, there was a New Guinea tribesman that asked him, why do white people basically have all the good stuff in life? And the book is sort of an explanation trying to, I guess the main theme was that Eurasia is laid out longitudinally, where the Americas and Africa are latitudinally laid out, and that geography is sort of destiny, and that's always been a kind of sore point in anthropology. Is that a correct assessment of that book?
Well, let's start. I mean, Guns, Germs, and Steel is a huge. It was absolutely his huge book. It's probably his best-selling book. I think probably his best book by far. It was interesting because 10 years after calling agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race, he comes out with a book in 1997 called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which basically said that the complex of agriculture, where it developed, was determining of the kinds of relationships that answered to the question that he was posed by someone in Papua New Guinea. Why do you, the Europeans, have all the cargo, and why did we not get it? And Diamond's answer to that was to go back into the origins of agriculture, and especially domesticated animals, the big domesticated animals. And his claim, which is actually correct, is that the big animals, the sheep, horses, cattle, are all domesticated in the Fertile Crescent in what is now the Middle East, along with the best cereal crops. And so from there, they had sort of the earliest domestication, the only real large domestic animals available for domestication, and that agriculture spread rapidly from there because it spread along lines, spread around longitudinal lines, rather than in the Americas and other places. It was much more difficult to spread agriculture north and south. So the Americas were very important in their crop and their plant domestication. So corn, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, they were all domesticated in the Americas, but they didn't have the large domesticated animals, and they also didn't have the kind of trade relationships that were happening in Eurasia. So yes, his argument, it basically is that Eurasia was favored because of its orientation geographically, but especially because of these large domesticated animals, which enabled muscle power, also power for armies, horseback riding eventually, and would enable them to develop different kinds of technologies as well, and as well as resistance to disease.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah,
domesticated animals brought huge numbers of plagues and toxins to the Europeans across Eurasia, really. But over time, they developed immunities to them or resistances to people in the Americas just didn't have.
Yeah, and probably the other book that has been really controversial was in the mid-'00s. He released Collapse, which tried to, I guess, get in tune with climate change and the passive civilizations on it. Probably, from what I recall, the most controversial claim there was his claims about Easter Island and what led to its collapse. And there's been back and forth over the last decade or so about whether he was correct. Let me just ask you, just again, a small précis on that book and its controversies.
Right. So Collapse, I mean, what was interesting about Guns, Germs, and Steel, if you think about reasons, what he's basically saying is that the Europeans were inadvertent conquerors, or their advantages came from things that they didn't possess genetically, or they didn't really even make decisions about them. They just happened to be the conquerors. And Collapse was called How Societies Choose to Succeed and Fail, or How some societies choose to fail. It's about a number of societies, and basically the claim was there that these societies had failed because of some choices made by the people who were running charge of those societies. And certainly the most controversial, in part because it was the most debatable claim, was about Easter Island. And there, of course, well, Diamond's claim originally, and it came out in an article again, I think it was in Discover magazine, called Easter's End. It's a beautiful little, like, Worst Mistake, it's a beautiful little Pressie's article that you can read, like, collapse, basically, 3 pages. So if you read that article, you get a sense for it. And it's basically that, here's a little island society, limited resources, but the people, because they want to make these big heads and outcompete each other, end up destroying all their resources. So his final line is that Earth is like Easter's Island writ large. Don't stop competing with each other and trying to make big giant heads or mansions. We're all going to end up Easter Island, which decimated.
Well, Easter Island, I remember as a kid, I first heard about that in relation to Eric von Däniken and his ancient astronaut theory. So that's always been sort of a hotbed of out of the way ideas. But let me just talk a little bit before we get into some more specifics about Diamond himself, because it seems to me that a lot of the criticism about Diamond, when you look online on science blogs and whatnot, it seems to oftentimes have a smack of envy of success. Because if you look at, for example, Carl Sagan, who I mentioned earlier, he was not well liked in the astronomy world of the 70s and 80s because of his appearances on Johnny Carson and his fame, and he had this sort of kind of smooth, sexy professor kind of look. And if you look at like Steven Pinker, for example, he's another person who in a recent book he had proposed some controversial ideas about humanity getting less violent. They weren't his. He was taking statistics other people have compiled and putting them up. But Steven Pinker has always been seen as a sort of nicer, gentler version of Noam Chomsky. Is part of the backlash against Diamond not just his ideas, but the fact that his books have made him, within the science world at least, a superstar?
I think popularity and envy, one can never discount that as a source of motivation. I've certainly tried to, in my own critique, separate out, the desire for fame, or why should an anthropologist, non-archaeologist be famous in this way, from, what's really important. What are the ideas of discussion? What are the importance of these ideas? I have nothing against someone who can popularize write a really great book, tell a really great story, get people interested in anthropology, archaeology, tell a great story about human beings. I've used Jared Diamond in plenty of classes. I still do. So I have nothing against kind of being able to transmit messages. I'll caveat that by I like people to sort of cite their sources and say, if you got your work from an anthropologist, you probably should say that. But, in general, I think it's fine to get people excited about that he's done a great job doing that. I try to, when I'm thinking about critique, I try to separate that out from I want to be famous, or I want to show, or I want to, have the same kind of publicity. I think that people want their own known, of course, but be careful. What's really.
Well, let me talk about the sort of overarching theses that he has gotten. It seems to me that, as a layperson, and I come from the arts, not the sciences, but it seems to me that he has consistently sort of attacked the idea, the myth, the stereotype of the noble savage. And it seems that sometimes that has caused a backlash in political circles. For example, like I said, the question asked by the young man that starts Guns, Germs, and Steel, why do white people have all the sort of good things, or whatever the actual question was. But and you even said that that Diamond consistently, it seems, says that it's not that Eurasians or Europeans or China were supermen or whatnot. They just happen to have developed in the right areas that are conducive to certain things. So do you think that Diamond is wielding a political axe, or do you think his opponents are wielding a political axe because of political correctness, say?
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated. You know, Diamond on the whole sort of I mean, there's a couple things you said which I'll sort of parse out here. Diamond on the noble savage is actually kind of has his back and forth, let's say. If you read the original article, like I said, the worst mistake in the history of the human race, it basically claims that everything was beautiful, or at least much more beautiful, before agriculture. So, you know, I mean, if you want to talk about resurrection of the noble savage idea, he's actually doing it quite nicely in that article. And in some ways, he does it in Guns, Germs, and Steel. And the implication is that without agriculture, we wouldn't have these sort of, you know, all these diseases anyway, and we wouldn't have the same kind of war weaponry. We wouldn't actually have the Guns, Germs, and Steel, which have been so detrimental to human history. So, you know, and then you look at this very most recent book, suddenly blanking.
The book is The World Until Yesterday, yeah.
You know, I mean, in some ways, it's, you know, I mean, it's and has its ups and downs. It's about, you know, what we learn in Silicon society. In that book, he is much more critical of levels of violence in traditional societies, which is, again, curious for me because in The Worst Mistake, he claims that it was agriculture that brought us the violence. And in his latest book, he kind of is going back on that. So I think there's been back and forth with regard to his ideas about the noble savage. You're absolutely correct that Guns, Germs, and Steel is officially launched as his criticism of the people who would say, well, you know, Europeans triumph because of high IQ or their racial superiority or those kinds of things. But for me, it seems like we knew that for a long time before Diamond. We knew that wasn't the crucial factor in why European societies were dominant. But yes, that's one of his. He gets sort of attacked from what we might say the hereditarians as well, because they don't like. They would like to. It was really IQ. So Diamond gets attacked. He doesn't really do a good job dismissing them as Guns, Germs, and Steel. He said, well, I know too much smart Papua-New Guineans to believe that. And as they put it, well, you know, that's just like saying I know too many women. Women are shorter than men on average. And so, you know, they're not very, they're not, no hereditarian, no sort of strong racist hereditarian has been convinced by Jared. Mm-hmm. Although, you know, at first sort of, I would say, members of the lay public, I think, you know, he does dispense with the idea that there's some sort of racial superiority.
Well, I don't know recall if it's in Guns, Germs, and Steel or maybe one of his articles, but I do remember reading something that he had written about the populating of the New World, you know, across the Siberian land bridge, the Bering land bridge, and how I think he had stated that it only took, for example, usually a couple of generations for a lot of the what we would consider Ice Age megafauna to be wiped out, i.e. that, you know, usually within 1,000 or less years of known human habitation, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers, the woolly rhinoceroses, and all this would tended to be wiped out, which I remember him sort of implying that, well, there goes the idea that, you know, all Native Americans, you know, sung Kumbaya and were happy. And the fact that even pre-Columbian societies, there were mass murders and wars just like in the rest of human history. So do you think, in regard to the Americas, do you think that Diamond is on sort of the right side of the coin in terms of that one of the reasons that the Native Americans were disadvantaged was because their ancient ancestors just happened to either deliberately or accidentally wipe out all the big mammals that could have given them the genetic resistance that you talked about earlier?
Right. I mean, I think that, you know, I mean, so Diamond talks about the big candidates for domestication, with what animals will be suitable. And that in the Americas, there just weren't any suitable candidates. I mean, I think that, it is possible that, I mean, without getting into the debate about sort of, what happened to the larger creatures that were there, I mean, I think that there is truth to the matter that in the Americas there just weren't that many big animals that were good for the kind of domestication that would have helped propel agriculture. As he points out, the only one that occurs is the llama, and you can't really ride llamas at all or use them to pull plow. And so, I mean, I think that I think there's merit to that argument in the sense that, and I guess here we're kind of getting into what's going on, sort of this big explanation. That explains why the Eurasian societies in general were perhaps more powerful. That is to say, the big domesticated animals, that comes from the Middle East, and, it's true that, societies in India, China, and in across the Eurasian continent tended to have, over time, more sort of technologically, trying to choose my words here, technologically more sophisticated societies and certain kinds of combat and, the kinds of things that you'd be able to then overrun the population.
Yeah. Is one of the reasons that you think Diamond gets so much flack is because he tends to be a big idea guy, but he doesn't take the time to detail the stuff or to back it up? I think, for example, a similar problem occurs in the field of consciousness. And I remember reading, to just give you another controversial guy, Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained in the late 80s was his sort of opus where he came to the idea that the mind is formed by the brain's processing of information. The overwhelm of information gives us what he called the illusion of the brain, rather than saying, or the illusion of the mind, rather than saying that's the essence of the mind. And in the almost 30 years since, he's never followed up and really detailed how that occurs. Does the same thing, do you think, apply to Diamond? He's got this geography is destiny kind of mantra, but he hasn't done the work in individual cases in the Easter Islands or in the Indonesia or other areas where that might not be. You know what I'm saying? Do you think he's just too sweeping?
I think that, I mean, I think that that's one of the issues is that, the whole role of the big idea person and who, what do you do when you have a big idea and then you have to kind of maybe revise it for empirical evidence? So let's take Easter Island. I think that, the big idea was, well, they fall because of competition and trying to outdo each other. Then people come along and say, oh no, what really caused this were the human introduced. That kind of got discarded. Another book that Jared edited, he talks about the rate of tree growth in Easter Island. So this kind of strange footnote. I mean, he kind of knows that the sort of idea of human competition hasn't held up over time. I think he actually realizes that and has, in some sense, does do the reading. But once you put that big idea out there, it's somehow, maybe that's not Diamond's fault. It's like not everyone is following up and saying, like, okay, here's my other big book that says why that idea was incorrect. Scientific work tends to proceed along the lines of caveats, falsifying hypotheses. That's not necessarily an entertaining thing to read when you're kind of some of your main work is about falsifying previous ideas. I mean, I think that applies to lots of journalism too. Well, right? You write the big headline about, this genetic breakthrough is going to give us a cure for this, and then, who reads the correction 3 days later and says, well, maybe we didn't get as much as we hoped for. So there's kind of a sell and a caveat footnote.
And also, if I recall, in Collapse, he used a handful of other major examples. One of them, I believe, was the Mayas. And the Mayas, from what I recall, the explanation was quite different from Easter Island. I think it was more that the area suffered a drought or something, an overpopulation, rather than the diminishment of actual resources. Am I correct in that?
And well, I mean, I think there's again a lot of debates about this. I mean, some of the examples he used in collapse are locations were extremely successful for 700 or 800 years.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's about the Maya collapse. Kind of strange. I mean, if you think about how long around as sort of an industrialized civilization, in that sense, you're going to think for 700 or 800 years. I mean, what society contemporaneously to our own would you think, wow, they're going to be amazing in 700 or 800 years, and so it's kind of strange to take a society that was extremely successful and say, oh well, they're going to collapse. I'm not sure what our own time horizon is so iffy.
Well, did he use any, either in Collapse or subsequently, has he used any other or Eurasian examples? For example, the Persian Empire or the Mongol Empire or the Roman Empire, or does he look at those civilizations having collapsed for political reasons rather than reasons of climate change or deeper cultural things? And is it only sort of what we'd call third world civilizations that he has included in this idea of collapse?
No, there's a couple other examples. I actually have bragged out questioning collapse with a couple of archaeologists, like some ancient societies as well. I think there's a couple of Eurasian examples in there. Again, the archaeologists in this sense, have been, I don't want to say critical of not just the empirical details, not just the details, but the kind of overarching framework which he uses. So again, I think Diamond also has a tendency, to say, "Oh, I'm walking away from this, this book about how ancient societies collapsed," without necessarily. It doesn't seem like he's done the homework to actually read. Another controversial example in there was how Hades or painting public. I mean, I think that on that example, again, he seems to get a lot of sort of historical material wrong.
Well, what do you think is the... Well, before I ask this question, let me just go back to the first book, The Third Chimpanzee, or the first book that became, I guess, a bestseller, you would call it. It seems to me that he used a lot of the same techniques, what we might call sweeping things, outside of areas that we could call racist or whatnot, because he tries to designate human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, as the third member of the chimpanzee family, along with bonobos and I guess, are they lowland chimps or whatever they're called, or regular chimps. Do you think that in of itself was a sweeping statement? Because there's always that question, like sometimes I sort of cringe when I hear paleontologists calling birds dinosaurs, because do we call reptiles sort of advanced amphibians? I mean, they've become birds fully. Are humans, do we really think that humans are chimpanzees? I mean, clearly we are apes, great apes in the sense, I guess. But do you think that is it fair to call us, a third chimpanzee, or was that another just sort of way you think to put a big get publicity for the book?
I mean, I think that was a huge headline. It wasn't the first time someone, I mean, I think that there was a very popular book called Naked Ape, right? So It was hardly the first time that headline was someone who had to pile of them, right? I mean, to say that, that birds are not dinosaurs, humans are, we definitely share a lot of characteristics with our larger primates, but we're not a third species. In fact, we're
And if you could just lean in, if you could just lean in a little closer,
yeah. You might look at there's an anthropologist or biological anthropologist named Jonathan Mark who wrote a book called he calls human X8 in the sense that we have a moment we're different from other apes. It's important to keep that in mind. So I mean I think there are these huge sort of sweeping headline claims which you have to be careful of, and you have to, to sort of explain. I mean, if you had to nutshell critique what Jared Diamond did in Third Chimpanzee and then Guns, Germs, and Steel, is that I think Chimpanzee got into a very kind of biologically determinist argument about human behavior. I mean, if you see another chimpanzee. Whereas in Guns, Germs, and Steel, he really takes it into a kind of, it's not exactly environmental determinism, but it is a kind of, biogeographical, everything that matters is where people developed agriculture argument. And so my main critique of this has been that what he doesn't explain is his question that he was asked by the person from Papua New Guinea. Why do you Europeans have all the cargo? He explains why Eurasian societies have been traditionally more powerful. But what he doesn't explain is the history of how in the past 500 or 600 years, these European societies, which for much of the 10,000 year span that he's talking about, were rather peripheral to the rest of Eurasia. We're not the big deal that other India or China was. So how do you explain why these European societies rose to become the sort of dominant societies in capitalism? That's a very different question, and it can't just be explained by big domesticated animals.
Well, can it be explained at all? Or are we just talking that it's random chance? I mean, it could have been people from the Ural Mountains. It could have been, people from Indochina. It could have been, people from the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, is it just the dice rolled that way and Western Europe, it came up a cropper?
Well, I mean, I think that you can never underestimate the role of chance in human history. I will give you that. But we also have to take into account decisions that were made. And so, I think that one of the things that Diamond really overlooks in Guns, Germs, and Steel is that the only reason the Europeans were able to topple the Incas in the Americas was because they made tactical alliances with natives who were basically opposed to being dominated by the Aztecs and opposed to being dominated by the Incas. And so it was the native allies, these, thousands or in some cases hundreds of thousands of people who actually formed the armies that would topple the Inca Empire and topple the Aztec Empire. And these, their exploits are completely left out of the European Chronicle. Obvious reasons. Like, who wants to make a story about how you got a huge amount of help from people who were pissed off at their Aztec overlords? They became crucial allies in basically making European expansion possible. So, in some ways, it's also about decisions people made in history. And if it all goes sort of who had the cows and who had the horses, those decisions and those actual consequences of decisions become irrelevant. It doesn't matter anymore. Whereas, at least in my take, and I think the history and anthropology that I know, we really want to take human decision-making into account, because it does matter. It doesn't matter all the time, but oftentimes it does. And these alliances were crucial. And so I think, if we go back to the Third Chimpanzee again, it's the same thing. Like, does human activity, does the stuff we have evolved to be matter, or are we just sort of another version of the chimpanzee? And I would say no to that. The same thing with history. Does it matter what people are deciding and what they are doing? And I think, yes, of course it was important in the conquest of the Americas, and it's important for and knowing what kinds of decisions that are being made. It's not just sort of people have power.
Yeah, I recently watched a documentary about called something like "When the Sahara Was Green" and how, about the 20,000 years cycle of the tilt of the Earth, and how the monsoons that now go through the middle of Africa and feed the Congo Basin at one time were up in the Sahara, and the theory being that about 5,500 years ago, when the Sahara sort of dried out again, these mega lakes dried up, and these people all sort of moved towards the Nile, the last source of water in the Sahara, and this gave rise to the Egyptians. So certainly, Diamond isn't wrong that physical forces, natural forces, do play an important role.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's absolutely true, and for those kinds of things, I think we just need to know, so when do human decisions matter? When is it important what human activity is important or not? And that is an empirical matter. It's not. Some people want to make it a political matter. They want to say human decisions are important in one case and not the other. But we have to look empirically. So let's go back to the Maya. What were the consequences of human decisions, and what were the environmental and physical factors? Those are all things that we can trace, and we need to be able to sort of take account of when we want to emphasize human activity and agency empirically, and when we want to talk about those factors that you are aware of. Nothing you can really do about it. If your land is turning into a desert, there's not much chance that your decisions are going to. So if you go from sort of guns, field collapse, that's really kind of the argument that's made is that for Diamond, the Europeans seem to be these inadvertent conquerors. The decisions that people made, the Europeans made, the decisions the natives made in the Americas don't seem to matter at all. The success of the Europeans is apparently inadvertent. But when it comes to collapse, it's mostly about the decisions that people make. And so, you're outside of Europe, then you can choose to collapse, and that's more a human choice. But if you're a conqueror, well, that's just sort of something that happened inadvertently, throwing the dice.
So do you think that the biggest flaw with Diamond's overall vision of human history is not any of the individual things he's proposed, but that some of his propositions have been in opposition to each other?
I think, over the years there have been a lot of opposing propositions, starting with agriculture is the worst mistake to the best thing that ever happened, noble before agriculture, to not noble at all. So I think there have been a number of conflicting propositions, but where do you place kind of the where do you employ those propositions is what's really critical. So if conquest is inadvertent, if the advantages Europeans had were inadvertent, then human decisions don't seem to matter in that case. Whereas if failure is something that people are doing, then it becomes that was their own fault. They obviously took the wrong decision. So there's a kind of blaming the victims while excusing the haves. They're sort of blame that. I think there's an article in that question blaming the have-nots and excusing the haves for what happened in history. So it's not necessarily a question of it's a question of being rigorous in terms of evaluating, okay, what role did human decision, human agency, history play in this, and what role did other factors play, and employing the same standard for different societies.
Let me just ask you then about people who have written, say, counter arguments, including yourself, if you want to include yourself. What could you give, 2 or 3 persons, theories, or books that you would recommend that anyone who has read any of these major books that we've mentioned of Diamond, The Guns, Germs, The Seal, Third Chimpanzee, and Collapse, that you would say act as a corrective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the issues that has surfaced over the years that, I've been thinking about with regard to Diamond is, what's the alternative? What else do you read? So for me, when I was becoming an anthropologist, when I was growing up in anthropology, the alternative was this old book I read my first year in college, Eric Wolf's book about history. And Eric Wolf's book was written in 1982. It was very much an anthropological and historical book. Very difficult to read, pretty difficult. But he covered a lot of the same territory as Joe Diamond did, geography, what was happening in these societies, covering the whole of the world. And it's an attempt to explain actually the same question that Jared Diamond posed, which was proposed to Jared Diamond. Why were European societies what account for? This is something that anthropologists and historians have been working on for the last 40 or 50 years, and the answers are very different. The problem is that where do you go from, the Eric Wolf, Europe, people without history? I think the problem is that for most people, that's gone into a super specialized literature. So the historians and the anthropologists all get busy doing their super specialized work. But, I'm trying to sort of think of the person who's written the big book, which I can say, okay, guys, here's the book that you need to read, which will help you, which will help you correct what Diamond was saying. And, I think that the world is, obviously there's still a market for these kind of big books about human history. I just got my copy of Sapiens. That's the new book that everybody's saying, Barack Obama's reading it, or, it's on everybody's summer reading list. It seems to be, at least, I haven't looked at it yet, but it seems to be in the same sort of big picture vein, and I'll have to get back to you about it.
Yeah, when you emailed me about that, I looked it up, and it's got as much, if not more, criticism than Diamond's books, in fact.
Right. Yeah, I think there's still, there's still an appetite for these kinds of big picture explanations. I do want to be able to provide for that in a way that is, that is honest and rigorous, that doesn't sacrifice accuracy, but it doesn't become, a kind of fall into the laws that I think that Diamond's work does. But I think this is still a gap or a problem that we have is that the people who want to be trained in history or in archaeology or anthropology and these sort of very specialized fields, and they kind of have they read a very different set of books. They develop a very different style. Jared Diamond published his big book in 1997. I was in graduate school then. We read a lot of things. We read a lot of authors, but I didn't ever hear about Jared Diamond. And so it's kind of until I started teaching. So it's one of those things where people don't realize it's actually reaching the public. So in some ways, I got into this because I realized that Diamond was a text for basically the text for high schools now. So instead of the things that some of the historians and anthropologists were working on in terms of Europe and people without history, we have this Guns, Germs, and Steel has become standard explanation. I'm not sure when and how that will ever be corrected. Rather pessimistic.
Well, popular science books tend not to age well versus, say, the stuff that a Darwin wrote, or the stuff that some other astronomers may have written 100 or so years ago. Do you think that in 50 or 100 years that Diamond's work will just be seen as a footnote, if at all, or do you think that he's going to be looked at the way, say, astronomers look at an Immanuel Velikovsky or Eric von Daniken, who I mentioned earlier, that it's just that it's going to, or do you think that there's at least something there that might last a little bit?
Wow, that's I don't want to accept harsh, but I think there's going to be, I think in some ways, Diamond's work is not so trendy. Right? I mean, I think that the new thing is that, now Bill Gates on to reading *Sapiens*. That's on his list. So it's kind of funny in some ways. He definitely caught a trend. 1997, I think, in some ways, the success of the book probably surprised everyone how much it sold. But over time, I think in terms of the scientific community and what will happen in 50 or 100 years, assuming there is still a scientific community and people out there, I'm going to have to say that he'll be seen as sort of more of a trendy author of the day, but not someone who's sort of advanced knowledge all the time. And I'm not saying that because I'm thinking I'm going to be that person who does it, and that's just my opinion.
Well, let me just ask you then, as we wrap up, about your own blog. I said I'll link to your Hartwick page, but you also have a blog called Living Anthropologically. But just let me ask, what is the purpose of that, and do you have any books yourselves that have come out of things you've written there?
Yeah, so I think that the purpose of starting that blog was really to put more anthropology into some of our big public discourse questions. So I think we do, I think anthropologists in general, do a pretty good job with their introduction to anthropology classes. We'll explain the big important things, but you don't see us necessarily out doing things about questions that are of more broader general interest. So it's an attempt to put more anthropology into public discourse, and obviously Jared Diamond's stuff has been one of the, which came out of my teaching basically, has been pretty successful for a small blog like mine. So the idea is to really expand that and to start kind of providing some of for an online audience, some of the questions that people have about what does it mean to be human, why do Europeans, why were Europeans dominant, what's the future of globalization, those kinds of questions. So, I'm really working on that. Thank you for, in this interview, actually encouraged me to revisit some of that material. In terms of my own writing, I did put out a book with a co-author based on field work in Ecuador and Colombia with my colleague Rudy Colorado Mansfield. Put in a last plug. It's called Fast, Easy, and in Cash, Partisan Hardship and Hope in the Global Economy. So it's about kind of local economies, partisans, what people might be able to do, the sort of role of human agency, you might say, in creating their own economic and livelihood ideas. So it's not directly related to Jared Diamond and the blog. Those are the projects I'm.
Well, let me just ask a final question. We've talked about some of these big questions, whether the question the Papua New Guinea asked Diamond. You just mentioned a handful of questions in your last little monologue there. If you, as a cultural anthropologist, could have 2 or 3 questions answered within your lifetime, what would those 2 or 3 questions be that could be answered?
Well, I think that I actually was trying to, so again, not to self-plug too much, in my last version of teaching Introduction to Anthropology, I tried to do something a little different in the last 10 classes, but ask 10 big questions about people. And, kind of thing where I would partially, when you type into Google and you type in, is something this, and certain things pop up, it's like everybody's searching for that. So I tried to sort of tailor the question that, hey, is more than one person in the world asking this question? So, here's one example. Is capitalism the best economic? So, I mean, is our current course, whatever capitalism that we want to call it, is that a sustainable and good idea to have? Or there's another funny things that pop up, like, is marriage natural?
Yeah.
And then the very last one is, what will happen in the future? I actually would like to have some idea, where we're headed. So in that last part, I tried to, at one and the same time, provide a number of caveats. Like, hey, you should really never, as a social scientist, make these kind of predictions. There's a lot of at the same time, what are some of the big trends that we're going to see? What are the things that are going to be happening? What are the things we keep our eye on in the next, 50 to 100 years? So, it's those kinds of things that I think hopefully unite, with students, what people want to know, with what people are trying to think about by listening to other people, which anthropologists do best.
Yeah, I was reading a few months ago about this big ring of garbage that's floating around the Pacific that's washing up on islands. I have this image of in about 2,000–3,000 years, if humanity doesn't evolve well, we're going to have something like the garbage nebula. That's just going to be human garbage floating out a few light years from us, and that there'll be warning beacons. Stay away. We got the garbage nebula coming up. It'll fuck up your whatever systems we use to travel faster than the speed of light. But anyway, I will link to both your Hardwick and your blog's pages. I want to thank you for spending almost an hour talking about anthropology and Jared Diamond. Thank you, Jason.